The United States owes 36 trillion. China owes 15 trillion. Japan owes 10 trillion. Germany owes 3 trillion. The UK owes 3 trillion. France owes 3.5 trillion. Every major nation on earth is in debt. Total global debt is $317 trillion. $317 trillion. So that's 330% of global GDP. Every dollar of production on earth doesn't equal the total debt. We'd need 3 years of global output with zero consumption to pay it off. But here's the question nobody asks. If everyone is in debt, who is the creditor? Who holds $317 trillion in assets if the rest of the world holds $317 trillion in liabilities? Debt is a zero-sum game. For every borrower, there's a lender. If the United States owes $36 trillion, someone owns $36 trillion in claims on the United States. If global debt is $317 trillion, someone owns $317 trillion in global assets. Who? The answer reveals the largest wealth concentration mechanism in human history, not through conquest, not through theft, through a system where the many borrow and the few lend, where interest compounds forever, and where debt mathematically cannot be repaid, so it grows perpetually while funneling wealth upward. Here's who actually holds the $317 trillion in global debt, how the system creates debt without creating money to repay it, why this is intentional design, not accidental crisis, which specific institutions and individuals profit from perpetual debt, and why the system must eventually collapse, but only after maximum extraction. Understanding this isn't about economics. It's about seeing that the global debt system is the mechanism by which wealth concentrates in fewer hands, while making that concentration appear natural and inevitable. Before we identify who holds the debt, you need to understand what debt actually is in the modern system. Most people think debt works like personal borrowing. You borrow $10,000 from a bank. The bank had $10,000 and lent it to you. When you repay, the bank gets its $10,000 back plus interest. This is not how modern debt works. When a government borrows money by issuing bonds, the money doesn't exist before the borrowing. The act of borrowing creates the money. The central bank or commercial banks buy the government bonds by creating money from nothing through ledger entries. The U.S. government needs $1 trillion. It issues treasury bonds. The Federal Reserve announces it will buy $500 billion of those bonds. Commercial banks buy the other $500 billion. Where does the Federal Reserve get $500 billion? It doesn't have it. It creates the money by typing numbers into a computer. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet increases by $500 billion in assets and $500 billion in liabilities. The commercial banks do something similar through fractional reserve banking. The money didn't exist before. It exists now because of the bond purchase. When the U.S. government borrows $1 trillion, that $1 trillion is created through the borrowing process. But here's the critical part. Only the principal is created. The interest is not created. If the government borrows $1 trillion at 5% interest, it must repay $1 trillion plus $50 billion interest per year. But only $1 trillion was created. The $50 billion to pay interest must come from somewhere else. Where? From future borrowing or from taxing the existing money supply? This creates a mathematical trap. Total debt always exceeds total money supply because interest is owed on debt but was never created. The system requires perpetual growth in debt just to service existing debt. This is not a bug. This is the design. Now let me show you who holds the debt. The answer is 4 categories of creditors: central banks, institutional investors, foreign governments, and wealthy individuals. First category, central banks. The Federal Reserve holds $5 trillion in U.S. government debt. The Bank of Japan holds $5 trillion in Japanese government debt. The European Central Bank holds $5 trillion in European government debt. The People's Bank of China holds $3 trillion in Chinese government debt. Central banks, globally, hold approximately $25 trillion in government bonds. This is 8% of the $317 trillion total debt, but it's the foundation because central banks create money to buy government bonds, enabling governments to spend beyond tax revenue. But who owns the central banks? The Federal Reserve is not government-owned. It's a private institution owned by member banks. The 12 regional Federal Reserve banks issue shares to member commercial banks. J.P. Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Citigroup, Wells Fargo receive a 6% annual dividend on their Federal Reserve shares. When the Federal Reserve holds $5 trillion in government bonds and receives interest, that interest ultimately flows to the private banks that own the Federal Reserve. The public believes the Federal Reserve is part of the government. It's not. It's a private banking cartel created in 1913 to allow private banks to profit from government debt. The Bank of England, created in 1694, was explicitly created as a private institution to lend money to the government. The government needed to finance war with France. Parliament authorized the creation of the Bank of England as a private company. The bank lent $1.2 million to the government and in exchange received the exclusive right to issue currency. From the beginning, central banks existed to profit private bankers by creating government debt. The ownership structures are more complex now, but the mechanism is identical. Central banks create money, lend it to governments through bond purchases, and receive interest paid by taxpayers. Second category, institutional investors. This includes pension funds, insurance companies, mutual funds, and sovereign wealth funds. These institutions hold approximately $120 trillion in global debt. Pension funds hold $50 trillion. Insurance companies hold $35 trillion. Mutual funds hold $25 trillion. Sovereign wealth funds hold $10 trillion. But who owns these institutions? Pension funds are theoretically owned by workers whose pensions they manage, but the workers don't control the institutions. The fund managers control them, and fund managers are paid based on assets under management. Insurance companies are owned by shareholders. MetLife, Prudential, AIG are publicly traded corporations, but share ownership is concentrated. The top 10% of households own 89% of stocks and bonds. The insurance companies are effectively owned by the wealthy. Mutual funds like Vanguard, BlackRock, and State Street manage $20 trillion in assets. Vanguard is theoretically owned by fund investors, but control rests with management. BlackRock and State Street are publicly traded, with ownership concentrated among wealthy shareholders. The pattern across all institutional investors is that control rests with a small management class, and the ultimate economic benefit flows disproportionately to the wealthy. Third category, foreign governments. Foreign governments hold approximately $30 trillion in debt issued by other countries. China holds $3.2 trillion in foreign assets, including $850 billion in U.S. Treasury bonds. Japan holds $1.1 trillion in U.S. Treasuries. Why do foreign governments hold other nations' debt? Because of the trade system. When China exports $500 billion more to America than it imports, China receives $500 billion in dollars. China buys U.S. Treasury bonds with the dollars. The system benefits both sides in the short term. America gets cheap goods, and China finances the purchases by lending the money back, but it creates long-term dependency. Within China, who benefits from holding trillions in foreign bonds? Not the average Chinese worker. The Chinese government holds the bonds, controlled by the Communist Party elite. Fourth category, wealthy individuals and family offices. The top 1% globally hold approximately $40 trillion in financial assets, much of it in bonds. The top 0.1% hold $20 trillion. The top 0.01%, approximately 500,000 families globally, hold $10 trillion. These families, the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, the Waltons, the Mars family, the Koch family, the Saudi royal family, hold massive bond portfolios. When you have $10 billion in wealth, you buy government bonds, corporate bonds, assets that pay interest safely. A family with $10 billion in bonds earning 4% receives $400 million annually in interest income. They don't work. They don't produce anything. They collect $400 million per year from interest paid by borrowers. This is the core mechanism of wealth concentration through debt. The wealthy lend to everyone else and collect interest perpetually. The interest is paid through taxes, through corporate profits extracted from workers, through mortgage payments. The wealth flows from the many to the few through the debt system. Now let's add up the four categories. Central banks hold $25 trillion. Institutional investors hold $120 trillion. Foreign governments hold $30 trillion. Wealthy individuals hold $40 trillion. That's $215 trillion out of $317 trillion. The remaining $102 trillion is held by smaller institutional investors, corporate treasuries, middle-class savers with bond funds in their 401ks, and various other entities. But even this is disproportionately held by the wealthy because wealth is concentrated. The bottom 50% of humanity holds almost no financial assets. They hold debt. They owe mortgages, student loans, credit cards, car loans. They're the borrowers. The top 10% holds most of the financial assets. They're the lenders. So the answer to who is the lender is the wealthy, operating through central banks they control, institutions they own, and direct holdings. The debt system is a mechanism to transfer wealth from the poor and middle class who borrow to the rich who lend. Now let me show you how this mechanism has operated throughout history. Medieval Europe, 1200-1500 AD. The Catholic Church was the primary lender. Monarchs borrowed from the church to finance wars. By 1500, the Catholic Church owned 25% of all land in Europe, acquired largely through foreclosures on debts. The Medici family in Florence, 1400s, became the wealthiest family in Europe through lending. They lent to kings, popes, merchants. The interest income from lending exceeded the profit from any business. By 1450, the Medicis were so powerful they could install popes and influence kings. The Bank of England, created 1694, was the formalization of the debt wealth system. King William III needed $1.2 million to finance war. Parliament authorized the creation of a private bank that would lend the money to the government. The bank would receive interest paid by taxpayers, and it would have the exclusive right to issue currency. This was the blueprint. Create a private institution with government-granted monopoly on money creation. That institution lends to the government. Taxpayers pay interest to the private institution. The institution's shareholders become wealthy through perpetual interest income. The Rothschild family, 1800s, perfected the system. Mayer Amschel Rothschild had 5 sons. He sent them to 5 European capitals: London, Paris, Vienna, Naples, Frankfurt. Each son established a bank. The family lent to every European government. After Waterloo in 1815, the Rothschilds held more government debt than any family in history.